Dear students, for this next lecture of subject Animal Systematic and Diversity. So we are dealing with the chapter study of Pila globosa. I, Amol Handore, Assistant Professor at Department of Zoology, welcome you for this next lecture on excretory system of Pila globosa. So if we take the recap of previous lecture, we have studied the blood vascular system of Pila, where we have studied structure and function of sinuses and veins, followed by types of sinuses and veins, composition of blood and its functions, and finally we summed up with the course of circulation in Pila. In today's lecture, we are going to deal with the excretory system of Pila. Here we will deal with the structure of excretory organ, functions of these excretory organs, and actual mechanism of excretion. So let's begin with today's lecture on excretory system of Pila globosa. So we know that the major function of excretory system is to get rid of the excretory products which are formed in the body. So these are basically in the form of nitrogenous waste. So it can be urea, ammonia or uric acid, and these needs to be removed from the body to maintain the internal water balance. So all the gastropods, they remove this nitrogenous waste product to maintain their internal water balance and homeostasis of the body. So this main body of all aquatic gastropod, it includes the pericardial glands as well, and they are present in near the heart. And the waste are basically secreted in hemolymph, which is equivalent to the blood in higher organism, where the further filtration takes place in the nephridium or kidney. So let's go through the organs of excretory system of Pila globosa. So there is a single organ of excretion present in Pila globosa, which is called as renal organ or kidney, or it is also referred to as organ of Bojanus. Now if we see the position of this renal organ, it is present behind the pericardium. It is a thick walled sac-like structure and it is very much folded inside. If we see the origin, it is coelomic in origin, that is, it is derived from the coelomic cavity, and being a true coelomic or having this coelomoduct, it has one opening into the coelom, that is the true coelomic cavity. We know that in Pila the true coelomic cavity is pericardial cavity. So this excretory system opens at one end in this pericardial cavity, and at the other end this excretory system opens into the mantle cavity, which is the exterior opening. So in the diagram we will see all these positions. Now this renal organ is further consisting of two distinct chambers. Okay, so there is a two chamber system. There is a right anterior renal chamber and a left posterior renal chamber. So there are two chambers in the excretory system which takes part in the process of excretion. In this diagram, in the first picture you can see the actual positions of the renal chamber seen from the above. So this large structure is the posterior renal chamber and this small structure is the anterior renal chamber. Here you can see the pericardium, which is the outer sac-like structure of the heart, and on the one side of posterior renal chamber you can see the position of intestine. Now this is the more clear view of this excretory system. So in this diagram you can see this wedge shaped structure. This is the posterior renal chamber. Now you will see a lot of branches of blood veins supplying, so it is richly supplied with the blood. Now this smaller leaf like structure here is nothing but the anterior renal chamber. If we see the position of anterior renal chamber, on one side of this you will have the mantle cavity situated here, and on the other side you have this pericardium present. On the other hand, when we see this posterior renal chamber, on one side you have the presence of coil of the intestine, that is the part of digestive system. So now let's study the first part of excretory system, that is the anterior renal chamber. Now if we see the appearance or color of this anterior renal chamber, it is reddish brown in color. The shape of this anterior renal chamber is somewhat oval in shape. Okay, so it is oval in shape. So since it is oval in shape, it will have two surfaces. The upper surface is called as a roof, and the lower surface of anterior renal chamber is called as a floor. Now if we see the position of this anterior renal chamber, it is situated in front of pericardium, that is the outer sac-like structure of the heart, and on the hind part or the other side it will have the mantle cavity. Now it opens into the branchial chamber of mantle cavity through a slit-like opening or aperture which is situated near epithenia. So in the picture we can see this, and on the other end the anterior renal chamber opens into the other sac-like structure or the remaining half of the excretory system, that is posterior renal chamber. So these two chambers, that is anterior renal chamber and posterior renal chamber, they are connected with each other through a opening. If we see the internal cavity from inside, it is a bag-like structure. So if we see the internal cavity of this anterior renal chamber is very much reduced. Why it is reduced? Because there is presence of triangular leaf-like lamellae. So as I said, this anterior renal chamber is oval in shape, so it will have both roof and the floor. So in this diagram we can see this is anterior renal chamber. It is oval in shape. It is not flat as it is looking, but it is oval. So it will have this upper side as the roof, and on the other side it will have the floor. Now in this upper side, that is roof, it will have thick longitudinal axis which is having efferent renal sinus. So in this diagram you can see this line, longitudinal middle line. This is nothing but the efferent renal sinus, and on this either side of this efferent renal sinus you will find small leaf-like processes. So you can see these linear processes on both the sides. These are leaf-like structures, so they are also referred to as lamellae. So axis of this efferent renal sinus have triangular leaf-like processes. These are also called as lamellae. Okay, so this is all about the structure of this anterior chamber of the anterior renal chamber. So as you have this axis on the roof, similarly there is another axis present on the floor of this anterior renal chamber, and that axis is called as afferent renal sinus. So on the floor you have afferent renal sinus, and on the roof you have the efferent renal sinus. Now let's study the structure of the remaining part of digestive system, that is the second chamber of the excretory system, which is called as posterior renal chamber. Now this posterior renal chamber is broad in shape and somewhat hooked shape area. If we see the color, it is brownish to dusky gray in color, and it is, if we see the position, it is situated behind anterior renal chamber. So in this diagram you can see it is situated behind the your anterior renal chamber. Now if we see, you can see a lot of blood vessels on the surface of this posterior renal chamber. So it is highly vascularized, supplied with the blood, because obviously this blood is going to carry the nitrogenous waste product. So these nitrogenous waste product which are present in the blood are filtered here, and they are, along with the water, they will be given out of the body, and the blood which is now without any nitrogenous waste will again go to the auricle for the pumping process. So this is situated behind anterior renal chamber, and if you see the exact position, it is between rectum on the left side, it is, which is the part of digestive system, end part of the digestive system, and pericardium on the right side. Okay, so it is present between the rectum and pericardium, as well as it will have the digestive gland situated on its right side. Now the internal cavity of this posterior renal chamber is large. In case of anterior chamber it was reduced, but in case of posterior renal chamber it is large cavity, and it also contains genital duct, and few coils of intestine are also present nearby. So in this diagram you can see the coils of the intestine situated near the posterior renal chamber, and some of the coils are even present in the interior chamber. On one side you can see the presence of pericardium. Okay, now if we see the more details of posterior renal chamber, it is richly supplied, as I already told you, with the blood vessels. So on entire surface you can see these blood vessels which are supplying the blood. So in these blood vessels are further divided into afferent blood vessels and efferent blood vessels. So in this diagram you can see these efferent renal vessels as well as the afferent renal vessels. Okay, in this diagram we can see that these two chambers, that is anterior and posterior chamber, are communicating with each other. So there is a opening present which connects these anterior and posterior chamber. Similarly, this posterior chamber also communicates with the heart. So it is attached at this position with a renopericardial aperture. So this opening is called as renopericardial aperture. So it is communicating with the heart as well as with the anterior renal chamber. So this opening between these two chambers is called as a opening between renal chambers. All these parts, these yellow structures, are nothing but the circulatory system which we have studied in the previous lecture, consisting of one auricle and ventricle. So these two systems are interconnected. So we have seen that once these nitrogenous waste products are eliminated in this excretory system, the blood is supplied back to the circulatory system for the pumping to the other organs of the body. Now if we study the exact physiology of this excretion, before that we will see these communication points or opening again. So the renal chamber communicates with the pericardium by what is we have just seen, that is renopericardial aperture, and it also communicates with anterior renal chamber through a small aperture, or aperture means nothing but opening. Okay, now let's study the final part of today's discussion, that is actual process of excretion, that is physiology of excretion. So both these renal chamber, that is anterior renal chamber as well as posterior renal chamber of pila, takes part in the excretory function. So both of them have the excretory function and they excrete all the nitrogenous waste products. Now through the richly supplied blood vessel to the posterior renal chamber, the blood carries the nitrogenous waste products, and these waste products are collected first by the posterior chamber, and then they are transferred to the anterior chamber. We have seen these two chambers are connected, so the excretory waste or the excretory fluid is transferred from the posterior chamber to the anterior chamber. So these two chambers have true excretory function. They are responsible for the removal of nitrogenous waste from the blood, which is supplied to the chambers. So posterior renal chamber, the excretory fluid is first passed to the anterior renal chamber. We were here that first all the waste material is collected by the posterior renal chamber and it is transferred to the smaller chamber, that is anterior renal chamber. We know that there is a small opening between these two chambers. Okay, now once this excretory waste is collected in anterior renal chamber, now it will move through the small opening that is called as renal aperture. So this anterior renal chamber will transfer this excretory fluid through this renal aperture into large cavity that is called as mantle cavity. And through this mantle cavity, finally the excretory waste will be given out of the body through right nuchal lobe along with the water current. So since this organism is living in water, so at that time the water is taken inside for the respiration, and once this respiration is done, water will be leaving out through the right nuchal lobe. So when this water is moving out of the right nuchal lobe, the excretory waste is added to it. So the excretory waste also goes along with the water current. Now the excretory waste in case of Pila globosa can be of all three types, that is ammonia or other ammonia compounds like urea and uric acid. So we know that there are three types of organisms, that is ammonotelic, ureotelic and uricotelic. Ammonotelic organisms means those excrete ammonia as excretory product. Ureotelic means those excrete urea as excretory product, and uricotelic organisms excrete uric acid as excretory product. However, in case of this pila, it can switch its excretory product. Sometimes it can excrete ammonia as waste product and sometimes it can excrete urea or uric acid as the waste product. Now when does it do that, we will see. So the excretory product can be ammonia, urea or uric acid. Now we know that pila is an amphibious animal. That means sometimes it can live in the water ecosystem and sometimes it can live on the land. So it can switch the excretory product. For ammonia excretion, large quantity of water is required. So when it is present in water, it will excrete ammonia as an excretory product. So during aquatic phase, it excretes ammonia as an excretory product, and when it is on the land, terrestrial phase, it excretes urea or uric acid as the waste product. So by this process, it can maintain the homeostasis of the body and also it can conserve the water. So when it is on the land, it can conserve the water by excreting the waste material in the form of uric acid. So this adaptation helps in the maintenance of water in pila when the seasonal changes happen. So this is all about the excretory system of the Pila globosa. So if we summarize today's lecture, the excretory organ of Pila comprises of the renal chamber or kidney, and it is further made up of two chamber, anterior renal chamber and posterior renal chamber. We have studied the structure of both these chambers. Both the chambers are highly vascularized, with the posterior chamber supplied with the blood vessels. So these blood vessels carry the blood to the posterior renal chamber. From this, the blood or the excretory product will be removed and it is transferred to the anterior renal chamber. From anterior renal chamber, through a small opening or the sinus, it will open into the mantle cavity. From mantle cavity, the excretory fluid is finally given out from the right nuchal lobe with the help of water current, which is entering in the body from left nuchal lobe. So from left nuchal lobe, water is entering. It will carry the excretory product and it will go out of the body through the right nuchal lobe. So this is all about the excretory system of Pila globosa. With this, we conclude today's lecture. Thank you for your patience here.